I want to welcome you to our hearing on fiscal year 2018 priorities for nuclear forces and atomic energy defense activities. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and for your service to our nation. In uniform or out, your service to the American people is greatly appreciated. We have a full witness panel today because due to the compressed schedule for the budget request and defense authorization bill, we're going to attempt to cover the waterfront on all things nuclear. We have the Honorable Frank Klotz, Administrator of the Undersecretary for Nuclear Security, Dr. Robert Soofer, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, General Robin Rand, Commander, Air Force Global Strike Command, Vice Admiral Terry Benedict, Director, Navy Strategic Systems Programs, and I know I'm going to butcher this one up, but Dr. John Zangardi, is that all right? All right. Acting Chief Information Officer at the Department of Defense, and Ms. Susan Kange, did I pronounce that right? You did. Acting Assistant Secretary of Energy for Environmental Management. 2.5 months ago, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Selva, testified before our full committee that, quote, "There is no higher priority for the Joint Force than fielding all the components of an effective nuclear deterrent, and we are emphasizing the nuclear mission over all other modernization programs when faced with that choice. We in the Joint Force put our nuclear deterrent as the #1 priority for modernization and recapitalization," close quote. This priority has now been clearly stated by 3 successive Secretaries of Defense, Secretary Hagel, Secretary Carter, and Secretary Mattis. As my friend and ranking member has repeatedly pointed out, this subcommittee agrees with that prioritization on a bipartisan basis. And I'm pleased to say that the fiscal year 2018 budget request put forward by the Trump administration 2 days ago reinforces that priority. This is good news. As a nation, we need to put our money where our mouths are. This committee played a key role in building the current broad bipartisan agreement on the importance of the U.S. nuclear deterrent and the urgent need to carry out the full nuclear modernization programs put forth by the Obama administration. Reflecting on the budget request, let's be clear about one thing. The $1 billion increase for NNSA's nuclear weapons activities goes a long way, but does not fully fill the gap identified by Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz in his letter to the OMB Director in 2015. The Secretary said there was over $1 billion gap between the program of record in FY18 and the funding allocated. We're still several $100 million short here. As the Trump administration embarks on its nuclear posture review, in which several of our witnesses are intimately involved, we will take stock today of all the priorities, policies, and programs related to the nuclear deterrence and nuclear security more broadly. Let me briefly highlight 2. A particular concern to this subcommittee are the nuclear advances made by foreign countries and how those impact our own deterrent. As we heard from the Defense Science Board earlier this year, quote, "Nuclear weapons are a steadily evolving threat in both new and familiar directions," close quote. We must understand how the threat is evolving and anticipate what must be done to compensate. The U.S. focus in recent years has been on downplaying the utility of nuclear weapons, but most other nuclear powers have not downplayed that threat. The U.S. will ensure its nuclear deterrent is robust and credible against all potential threats today and for the long term. Another longstanding concern of this subcommittee has been the state of the infrastructure within the NNSA enterprise. This committee has had several hearings on the topic in the past year, and I'm pleased that the budget request provides significantly additional funding here. We will take a look at the projects that are being proposed and make sure they are truly buying down the massive backlog of deferred maintenance and repair needs. We will also look to see what authorities and processes can be provided or streamlined to ensure we're doing this smartly, effectively, and efficiently. In closing, let me revisit something that General Hyten, Commander of U.S. Strategic Command, said at our hearing back in March. Quote, "At a time when others continue to modernize and expand strategic capabilities, nearly all elements of the nuclear enterprise or nuclear delivery systems, weapons, stockpile, NC3, and other critical infrastructure are operating well beyond their expected service life. Planned sustainment and modernization activities must be completed on schedule, as a delay will impact the execution of our strategic deterrence mission and unacceptably degrade our ability and ultimately our credibility to deter and assure," close quote. For our #1 priority defense mission, this is a sobering reminder of the tremendously important job facing these witnesses and this subcommittee. So let's get to work. I want to thank our witnesses for being here and look forward to our discussions. With that, let me turn to my friend and ranking member from Tennessee, Mr. Jim Cooper, for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to welcome the witnesses, and in order to save time, I would ask unanimous consent that my opening statement be made part of the record. Thank you.
It's one of the many reasons I like him. He's short and to the point. All right. We're going to be called for votes in about an hour, so if the witnesses could, your full opening statement will be submitted for the record. If you can summarize in about 3 minutes, then we'll get to questions more rapidly. General Klotz, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will summarize, hopefully at 3 minutes. To Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, and other members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present the President's fiscal year 2018 budget request for the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. We value this committee's strong support for the 3 pillars of NNSA's mission: the nuclear weapons stockpile, nuclear threat reduction, and naval reactors. Our budget request, which comprises approximately half of the DOE budget, is $13.9 billion. This represents an increase, as you pointed out, of nearly $1 billion, or 7.8%, over the fiscal year 2017 omnibus level. This budget request is vital to ensuring that the U.S. nuclear force remains modern, robust, flexible, resilient, ready, and appropriately tailored to 21st century threats, and to reassure our allies. It also is indicative of the strong support of the administration for the mission and the people of the National Nuclear Security Administration. NNSA's FY 2018 budget request for the weapons activity appropriation is $10.2 billion, an increase of nearly $1 billion, or 10.8%, over the fiscal year 2017 omnibus level. This increase is needed to both meet our current life extension program commitments and to modernize our research and production infrastructure so we are positioned to address future requirements and future challenges. The 2018 budget request also includes $1.8 billion for the Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation Account, which is consistent with the funding level in the FY 2017 omnibus. This appropriation continues NNSA's critical and far-reaching mission to prevent, counter, and to respond to nuclear threats. The request for our third appropriations, the Naval Reactors Program, is nearly $1.5 billion. This represents an increase of $60 million, or 4.2%, above the FY 17 omnibus level. Not only does the requested funding support today's operational fleet, it enables naval reactors to deliver tomorrow's fleet. Our budget request for the fourth and final appropriations account, federal salaries and expenses, is $418 million, an increase of $31 million, or 8.1%, over the FY 17 omnibus level. The request supports recruiting, training, and retaining the highly skilled federal workforce essential to achieving success in technically complex 21st century national security missions. In closing, our FY 18 budget request reflects NNSA's motto, mission first, people always. It accounts for the significant tempo of operations at NNSA, which in many ways has reached a level unseen since the Cold War. It includes long overdue investments to repair and replace infrastructure at our national laboratories and production plants, and it provides modern and more efficient workspace for our highly talented scientific, engineering, and professional workforce. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, sir, and I look forward to answering any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, General. Dr. Soofer, you're recognized for the first of many occasions before this committee, I'm sure.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the President's fiscal year 2018 budget request for nuclear forces. The President directed the Department of Defense to conduct a comprehensive nuclear posture review, and we expect to complete it by the end of this calendar year. I will not prejudge the outcome of the NPR, but will outline some of the challenges and questions that we face. For decades, U.S. nuclear forces have provided the ultimate deterrent against nuclear attacks on the United States and our allies. Nuclear weapons remain a foundational element of U.S. strategy for deterring strategic attacks and large-scale war, and for assuring U.S. allies. Effective deterrence requires a deliberate strategy and forces that are structured and postured to support that strategy within the existing security environment. Strategy, forces, and posture must also be flexible enough to maintain stability while adjusting to both gradual and rapid technological and geopolitical changes. Recent years have indeed brought changes that U.S. policy must address. Russia has undertaken aggressive actions against its neighbors and threatened the United States and its allies. It has elevated strategies for nuclear first use, is violating the landmark Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and is modernizing a large and diverse non-strategic nuclear weapons force. In the Asia-Pacific, China's increased assertiveness suggests a desire to dominate that region. North Korea's leadership has demonstrated a willingness to accept economic countermeasures and international isolation in order to advance its nuclear capability and develop ballistic missiles able to strike the United States homeland as well as our allies in the region. The United States remains committed to ensuring that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. As the administration conducts its policy review of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, we will continue to meet our commitments under the deal. Iran continues its ballistic missile program, which is outside of the JCPOA. It's against this backdrop that the President directed DoD to ensure that the U.S. nuclear deterrent is modern, robust, flexible, resilient, ready, and appropriately tailored to deter 21st century threats. Each of these characteristics contributes to the effectiveness of our deterrent strategy. As we conduct the NPR, Secretary Mattis has directed that we continue with the existing program of record for recapitalizing our aging nuclear forces. After decades of deferred modernization, replacement programs must proceed without further delay if we are to retain existing deterrent capabilities. DoD expects nuclear recapitalization costs to total approximately $230 to $290 billion over more than 2 decades. This includes the total cost of strategic delivery systems that have a nuclear-only mission and a portion of the B-21 bomber, which will have both conventional and nuclear roles. It also includes modernizing nuclear command and control and communication systems. During this coming period of increased spending for replacement programs, nuclear forces will remain a small fraction of the DoD budget, with annual funding levels, including sustainment and operations, projected to range from approximately 3% to 6% of total defense spending. The President's budget request for FY 2018 fully funds DoD nuclear recapitalization programs and provides for nuclear force sustainment and operations. It also adds more than $3 billion across the future year's defense plan relative to the previous year's request to continue improving the health of the DoD nuclear enterprise. These investments demonstrate the President's commitment to nuclear deterrence and national defense. The critical mission of ensuring an effective nuclear deterrent is the highest priority mission of the Department of Defense and one it shares with the Department of Energy and the Congress, and we look forward to continuing to work together in faithfully and responsibly fulfilling this mission. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Soofer. General Rand, you're recognized.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for allowing me to appear before you today to represent the men and women of Air Force Global Strike Command. I've testified multiple times for the subcommittee, and I'm looking forward to speaking about the progress and the changes that have taken place in our command since our last meeting in July of 2016. I'm happy to provide my inputs and answer any questions on the ground-based strategic deterrent, long-range standoff weapon, and the B-21 Raider, infrastructure requirements, nuclear command, control, and communication systems, and other programs within Air Force Global Strike. Fiscal constraints, while posing planning challenges, do not alter the national security landscape or the intent of competitors and adversaries, nor do they diminish the enduring value of long-range strategic forces to our nation. Mr. Chairman and subcommittee members, I want to thank you for your dedication to our great nation and the opportunity to appear before the committee to highlight the need for modernization and efforts across Air Force Global Strike Command. I look forward to your questions.
That was a record, like 1 minute. Awesome. Admiral Benedict, you're recognized.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today representing the men and women of our Navy's strategic systems programs. I would like to briefly address the long-term sustainment of the sea-based leg of the triad. While our current life extension efforts will sustain the D5 system until the 2040s, the Navy is already beginning to evaluate options to maintain a credible and effective strategic weapon system to the end of the Columbia-class service life in the 2080s. At SSP, we are looking long-term and across the spectrum, from our workforce and infrastructure to our industry partners and geographic footprint. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today about the sea-based leg of the triad. I'm pleased to answer your questions at this time.
He beat you by 10 seconds, General. I'm sorry. Doctor, they won't beat Cooper. Dr. Zangardi, you're recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today on the Department's nuclear command, control, and communication systems and the risks, challenges, and opportunities within the system and related programs, policies, and priorities for modernization and recapitalization of the NC3 system. I am the Acting Department Chief Information Officer, and I am the Senior Civilian Advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Information Technology and the information enterprise that supports the DoD command and control, which includes the responsibility for policy, oversight, guidance, and coordination for the Department's NC3 system. My written statement provides more detailed information on these matters, but I want to highlight to you some of the Department's activities in this critical, important mission area. My office's fiscal year 2018 capabilities planning guidance states that we need to strengthen our national leadership command capabilities to meet changing threats and to help the President and national leadership ability to command U.S. forces. I believe this budget will help both these areas as we identify threats and ways to mitigate them, which in turn helps our nation's leaders maintain positive control of the U.S. nuclear armed forces. Specifically, the Council on the Oversight of the National Leadership Command and Control Communication Systems has proved to be a crucial element of the Department's strategy. We have been heavily focused on NC3 modernization and sustainment programs. We continue that focus, but will operationalize the discussion based upon what our main customers, U.S. STRATCOM, Joint Staff, U.S. NORTHCOM, and the White House require to accomplish their mission over the short and long term. Our objective is to ensure with high confidence that the systems provide the operational capability in time of crisis. Finally, communications is always the key. And I believe the two-way communication between your professional staffers and our DoD teams have increased the capability and readiness of our NLCC enterprise. This communications flow has provided clarity to the NC3 mission area. Its acquisition process provided stability for NC3 program offices and ensured warfighter capabilities. We are not done. We have more work to do, and the Department is actively pursuing modernization while operating within the confines of a constrained budget environment. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Keynes, you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cooper, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to represent the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management and to discuss the important work we have recently accomplished, as well as what we plan to achieve under the President's fiscal year 2018 budget request. The total budget request for the EM program is $6.5 billion, and of that, $5.5 billion is for defense environmental cleanup activities. Before discussing this request, I'd like to take a brief moment to update you on a recent incident at the Hanford site. As you know, there recently was a partial collapse of one tunnel near the Purex facility that has been used since the 1950s to store contaminated equipment. Based on extensive monitoring, there was no release of radiological contamination from the incident, and no workers were injured. Workers have filled in the collapsed section with soil and placed a cover over the tunnel. We are working closely with the state of Washington for a more permanent solution. We take this event very seriously and are looking closely at lessons learned. Maintaining and improving aging infrastructure is a priority for EM, and this incident emphasizes the need to continue to focus on these efforts. With regard to recent accomplishments, we continue to demonstrate our ability to make significant progress through achievements like resuming shipments of transuranic waste to the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, or WIP. Our fiscal year 2018 budget request will enable us to build on this momentum. The request allows EM to continue to make progress in addressing radioactive tank waste, as well as continuing other important work such as deactivation and decommissioning, soil and groundwater cleanup, and management and disposition of special nuclear materials, spent nuclear fuel, and transuranic and solid waste. Our request also includes funding to support the National Nuclear Security Administration by tackling some of their high-priority excess contaminated facilities in Oak Ridge and at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. In particular, the 18 request supports continued waste emplacement at WIP. At the Savannah River site, the request supports continuing the tank waste mission through commissioning and startup of the salt waste processing facility. And at Hanford, the budget request supports continued site remediation along the river corridor, and it supports beginning to treat low-activity tank waste by 2023. In closing, I'm honored to be here today representing the Office of Environmental Management. We're committed to achieving our mission safely and successfully. Thank you, and I'm pleased to answer any questions.
Thank all the witnesses, and I'll recognize myself first for questions. General Klotz, you talked about the $1 billion increase that's in your budget, and while it looks like a lot, it is a lot. There's a lot of deferred maintenance in NNSA, and this is something that the Obama administration recognized early, and without objection, I'd like to introduce a letter to that effect from Secretary Moniz from December 15 that clearly states an extra $1 billion a year is needed starting in FY18. In that letter, Secretary Moniz says, quote, "We estimate that an additional $5.2 billion over the FY18 through 21 is needed. Failure to address these requirements in the near term will put the NNSA budget in an untenable position beginning in FY18 and will provide misleading marker to the next administration as to the resource needs of the nuclear security enterprise," close quote. General Klotz, is this $1 billion increase for NNSA's weapon activities just filling a gap, or is it essential part of a long-term recovery from your current circumstance?
Thank you very much for that question, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all the support that this committee has provided to dealing with the infrastructure issues that we have within NNSA. And I also appreciate the broad bipartisan support for that effort that you outlined in your opening statement. We're very grateful for the level of spending that has been proposed in the President's FY18 budget. It will allow us to tackle some of our very important infrastructure recapitalization projects, such as the uranium processing facility at Y-12 in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which we expect to complete design this year and actually start construction next year. But we didn't get into the situation we face with aging and in some cases crumbling infrastructure overnight, and we're not going to get out of it in a day. So expect us to come forward next year and in subsequent years with requests to begin funding some other very important recapitalization efforts in the area of restoring our ability to produce plutonium pits, in restoring our ability to process the lithium which we need for our nuclear weapons program, and investments to replace our ability to fabricate trusted microsystems that we need to ensure that we have the radiation-hardened electronics for our nuclear forces.
It's fair to say, and my question is it fair to say that this is the first year of 5 years funding that was a program of record by the Obama administration as being essential that was presented to this Congress?
I think it's fair to say that the new administration came in and took looked at our requirements and our needs with a fresh set of eyes, and that they agree that this is ensuring that we can complete our life extension programs in order to deliver systems to the Air Force and the Navy on time, on schedule, and on budget is essential, and also fixing our infrastructure so that we are flexible and responsive to the needs of our nuclear deterrent both now and well into the future.
Okay. General Rand, the GBSD and LRSO DMRR contracts are supposed to be hitting their targets in August or September of this year. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir, that is accurate.
So you don't see a problem with that slipping?
No, sir, and I have no indication that'll be delayed.
Okay. Do you believe, there are many critics that believe the LRSO is destabilizing. Is that your opinion?
No, sir.
Can you tell us why?
Well, we've had a nuclear cruise missile since the 1960s. This is not a new capability. It's an improved capability over the outcome that we currently have, the air-launched cruise missile. And when you're in bombers and you take off, first of all, there's a visible presence. And as we fly today, the enemy, potential adversaries, don't know if we're conventional or nuclear. And I don't view that as destabilizing at all.
Great. With that, I will yield to the ranking member for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are many good parts and many bad parts to the recent budget that was submitted to Congress. I thought one of the good parts was the termination of the MOX facility in South Carolina. General Klotz, would you like to reflect on that?
Thank you, Representative Cooper. As I indicated, the new administration came in and looked at a lot of programs that are within the scope of the Department of Energy and the National Nuclear Security Administration, and came to the conclusion that the MOX fuel fabrication project in Savannah River, South Carolina, ought to be terminated. The conclusion was based on the fact that this is an extraordinarily expensive program. $5 billion have already been invested in it. We estimate it would take an additional $12 billion to go just to complete the project, and that doesn't even begin to address the costs of long-term cost of operating the program. We have developed an alternative strategy for disposing of excess weapons-grade plutonium. It's called the dilute and dispose approach, which we briefed to this committee last year. It is a proven technology. We have already emplaced diluted plutonium at the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, the WIP facility in New Mexico. It is not, we know what it's a proven technology, the risks are lower, the costs are lower, and it gets plutonium out of the state of South Carolina far faster than the MOX project would.
Thank you, General. I hope my colleagues pay attention to the General's comments, because this is an annual issue in the Defense Authorization Bill. So I hope that we can come to a sensible resolution. This issue has hung fire for many, many years now. Ms. Kange, regarding Hanford and the tunnel collapse, it's my impression that in the Trump budget, we're reducing the appropriation or the authorization for Hanford by over $100 million. Is that right?
Yes, sir. The FY18 budget request for the Richland Operations Office is reduced from what the 17 omnibus amount was.
So you'd mentioned we're going to be cooperating with the state of Washington on fixing that tunnel problem other than just putting dirt on it.
Yes.
So what's likely to be the resolution?
There's a number of alternatives that have been developed and are currently being evaluated. They range from potentially filling the tunnel with a fillable grout material to stabilize the tunnel and the contamination until such a time that a permanent remedy will be implemented, to, at the upper end, constructing a structure over the tunnel. So the various alternatives are still under evaluation.
So we're really not talking about a fix. We're talking about covering up the problem or stabilizing it.
We're talking about ensuring that we stabilize the tunnel and the material that is contained within the tunnel in a way that this type of incident will not occur again until a final remedy is reached between the tri-party parties.
But no one will be able to use the tunnel in the meantime.
The tunnel has not been used since the early 1950s.
Dr. Zangardi, many of the NC3 programs are delayed or over cost. In fact, when you look at the long list of those that are delayed and or over cost, it's almost hard to find one that is working on time as expected. What are we going to do to improve the performance record here?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Regarding NC3 programs,
Could you pull the microphone closer?
Breaking the answer down into two parts. First, I run the NLCC, and as part of the NLCC, we have taken a review of these programs and understand your concerns and recognize the delays to the program. The Air Force has been tasked by the chairs of the NLCC. AT&L is one of the chairs, along with the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to review these programs, look for areas of causality, is there a common cause or root cause between all these problems, and develop solutions to get the programs back on track. The Department is very focused on correcting these issues. Additionally, we were in Omaha, where we had a group meeting of about 30 seniors to look at the NC3 enterprise several weeks ago. Tasks came out of that to begin looking at things we can do to improve the overall operational resilience of the systems that are currently out there. So we're looking at it in two ways. One, with the NLCC, figuring out how we can improve the program's performance as they come on in the future, and two, dealing with the systems that are out there that we must currently maintain.
So is your answer consistent with the #1 priority that the nuclear mission has within the Department of Defense?
Yes, sir, it is. We have stated very clearly in meetings with my leadership that this is the highest priority. We have stated that very clearly in the NLCC council meetings, and it was very clear when we met at Omaha that this is the highest priority. I'm in lockstep agreement with General Hyten on these issues, sir.
So we are going to be performing better in the future, and I can hold you to that.
Our objective is to perform better in the future, sir, and I'll be glad to come back and answer any questions in the future if problems arise or to talk to you about performance.
Well, I think that sounds a little bit like accountability, but I'm not sure that that's full accountability. The willingness to answer questions, presumably you'd be willing to answer questions anyway.
Yes, sir. It is accountable. I am working these areas. I report directly to the DSD on these areas and keep him apprised of it. The accountability is very clear, as it's defined in recent legislation in the NDAA about DoD CIO having responsibilities in the NLCC area.
As you well know, without command and control, the weapon systems are largely useless.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions until the
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from the great state of Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Thank you,
any
Mr.
questions he may
Chairman.
have.
Admiral Benedict, I'm concerned about the tight time frame for the Columbia class, and I know you are too. And looking at it, I know that there's not too much wiggle room there. So I'd like to ask you this question. If the Columbia class program is delayed or slips by just 1 year, will there be a gap in the sea-based leg of the triad?
Yes, sir. Today, the current program has basically one Columbia-class entering service, as one Ohio replacement platform depart service. So if there was a slip, although we believe firmly that we can execute the program of record, there would be a gap. Yes, sir.
Now, and I appreciate your saying it as clearly as you did, because we need to hear that as we go forward into budgets, not just this year, but as you know, in the entire cycle that we've got here. We just don't have any room for not hitting the mark each year. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. We've already taken a 2-year slip in the Columbia class, which pushed us basically line on line with the Ohio's retirement. Yes, sir. That gap has been eroded.
Admiral, thank you for your candor. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here as well. We're aware that in this budget there's a 5% decrease for defense nuclear nonproliferation. And I'm just wondering how we justify that. I know you mentioned it was consistent, I believe, with the Omnibus 17 Omnibus, but at the same time we're requesting increasingly large sums of money for our own nuclear arsenal. Is there a disconnect here, and how do you translate this to the general public?
Thank you very much for that question. My explanation will be a little lengthy, perhaps, because I think the misunderstanding has to do with how the budget appropriations accounts are laid out in the budget. Under the line that we call defense nuclear nonproliferation, I would bend them in 3 different ways. First of all, there are those things that we do in the traditional nonproliferation mission space. Then there are dollars that we pay for our ability to counter nuclear terrorism and respond to, God forbid, a radiological or nuclear incident anywhere in the United States or abroad. And then there is also the construction project under the Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation account, which includes the MOX fuel fabrication facility that Representative Cooper just asked about. So the bulk of the reduction in that appropriations account reflects the administration's proposal that we terminate the MOX project. So the total amount of money going to MOX goes from the FY17 omnibus level of about 345, I believe, down to 279. So that accounts for a lot of it. In the area, and we've also seen an increase in our ability to, the spending that we want to have for nuclear counterterrorism and incident response in order to recapitalize all the equipment, the radiation detectors, the secure wireless telephones that our people would use with other domestic partners in responding to it. In the pure defense nuclear nonproliferation area, the funding is relatively flat. It would have been exactly flat if the Congress had appropriated what we requested in FY17, but you plussed us up a little bit at a week or two before the budget went to press, and so there was just a very, very slight decrease in the overall spending that we're proposing for defense nuclear nonproliferation. Okay. It's still a very robust program. $1.8 billion is a very robust program in this area.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I think, Dr. Soofer, to you as well. I mean, would you agree that the nuclear deterrent is our #1 priority?
Yes, ma'am, I would. Deterring nuclear attack and assuring our allies has been a fundamental and enduring goal of the United States government during the Cold War and over the last 3 nuclear posture reviews.
Would it be a better, I guess, example or demonstration of that if we did, as the NSA did, a long-term plan for nuclear weapons modernization? It's my understanding that the Department of Defense doesn't really submit a 25-year plan for its nuclear weapons plan. Is that accurate, and how do we, again, connect that?
Well, we currently have plans to modernize each leg of the nuclear triad, as well as the nuclear command and control system, and that modernization will take us out until about 2040. We provide Congress an annual report on funding over the next 10 years, the Section 1043 report. But you're correct, Congresswoman, we don't do a 25 or 30-year plan, but we have forces planned that will last over those years.
Mm-hmm. I think my time is up, but perhaps there's a way to better frame that so that there's a sense of more consistency. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Soofer, and thank you all for being here and your service. Dr. Soofer, if we studied the technical feasibility of mobile capable ICBMs, and along with the advantages and disadvantages of those possible weapons, would we learn useful information?
I'll ask General Rand to comment on that, but I can assure you that as we conduct a nuclear posture review, everything's on the table, and that is something that we will have to look at.
Sir, we have looked at that with the GBSD, and it is our best judgment that we do not go to mobile. I can talk more in the closed session and reasons why.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to ask General Klotz and Dr. Soofer another question. I'm not a fan of the New START treaty. For one thing, it's a relic of the Cold War. It did not address emerging powers like China, just ourselves and the former Soviet Union. And when it was passed, we now know the Russians were cheating on the INF treaty. And whether or not the Obama administration knew this, the senators who voted on it did not know that fact. So I've been distressed because the Obama administration was quick to start the dismantling of our nuclear forces that were called for under the New START treaty, but slow to do the modernization that was promised as a hedge against losing capability. So for either General Klotz or Dr. Soofer, please give an update on what we have left to do, what's remaining to be done to update our nuclear enterprise, which remains unfinished.
Thank you, Congressman. On the NNSA Department of Energy side, our priorities as far as sustaining and modernizing our nuclear enterprise at the moment are focused on 4 major weapon systems that ride on either the Navy sea-launched ballistic missiles or the Air Force two legs of the triad. So a level of effort, as I think I suggested in the opening comments, that we have not seen since the end of the Cold War. We are also focused on making sure that within the NNSA, within our nuclear enterprise, we have the scientific, technical, and engineering base and the production infrastructure that is necessary to continue to sustain a modern and effective nuclear arsenal, and also to be able to adapt or respond to any unexpected challenges, whether they're technical challenges or whether they're political military challenges. And our budget request for FY18, I think, reflects the importance of continue to make investments in this area.
Okay, let me follow up on that, and then we'll get to Dr. Soofer. Even if we do everything in the budget that you recommend, and I hope we do, how much of a gap will we still have? I'm just asking in general terms, not specific terms, for the public at large.
I still think, as I was responding to Chairman Rogers' remarks, I still think we have underinvested in the nuclear enterprise since the end of the Cold War. It's almost as if when the Berlin Wall went down and the Soviet Union collapsed, we all heaved a sigh of collective relief and said, thank goodness we don't have to worry about that anymore. And so for the subsequent years, we didn't make the investments we needed. It was not a high priority, either in the services or, for that matter, in the Department of Energy. We've been trying to rectify that for a number of years now on both sides of the Potomac. But as I indicated, it took us a long time to get into this situation. It's going to take us a while to get out of it, but we're working it very, very hard. And with this particular budget, we make a huge down payment in some key critical areas that we need to continue sustaining our nuclear weapon stockpile and our infrastructure. There will be more to follow as we go through our process of deciding how best to recapitalize that. So I would expect in next year's budget and in subsequent budgets, you will continue to see us place an emphasis on restoring our infrastructure.
I know time is limited, Dr. Soofer. I'm sorry, sir. Your comments about the New START treaty are well taken. In fact, when the Congress considered the New START treaty, and particularly the Senate, they realized that the disparity in tactical nuclear weapons, right, non-strategic nuclear weapons between Russia and China was something of great concern, and that needed to be addressed. And since then, Russia has actually increased the numbers of its non-strategic nuclear weapons, and the INF treaty violation is just one example. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. O'Rourke for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Benedict, I'd like to get your comments and your thoughts on commonality between Navy and Air Force. My understanding is that you could have similar components for land-based deterrence and sub-launched deterrence. Do you feel that you have the level of cooperation with the Air Force necessary to do that? And also, could you talk about just what that means in numbers in the budget? My understanding is we would, in a strategy like this one, likely spend a lot more up front to save a lot more down the road. What are we looking at in terms of numbers? And any comments or thoughts you'd like to share with us so that we're aware in the FY18 budget, and then also as we look ahead to future budget years, the kinds of factors that we need to be looking at to make sure that this is a success.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. I'll provide my answer, and then I'd like to offer, if it's okay with you, General Rand's comments on this subject. Commonality is an initiative that I've been pushing for a number of years. Through the concurrence of, at that time, Admiral Haney out at Stratcom and the two RDAs the two assistants in the Navy and the Air Force, the Navy and the United States Air Force were directed to do a commonality study. That took about a year. We looked at a spectrum from totally common missile to piece parts to the programs of record. Obviously, we came through a technical analysis that said total commonality had a number of major technical challenges as well as infrastructure challenges, which made doing that in today's environment financially and from a schedule standpoint unfeasible. The concern is the budget, and we all understand the budget to recapitalize. That's been discussed here. So what we came up with at a fairly deep technical analysis is opportunities in all the major subsystems. We worked those together, and we pushed that back up through the leadership change. In parallel with that, the United States Air Force was running its preps for the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrence Program. Their acquisition strategy was to turn that over to industry. All that information was passed to industry in a bidder's library. And so the industry partners who bid on the GBSD have the opportunity to draw from that library and submit that as part of their proposals. Those proposals are actually in process of review by the United States Air Force, and General Rand can talk to that. I think once we see the results of that down select as part of the Air Force process, then we are prepared with the Air Force to re-engage and share and continue down the path of commonality. But right now, I will say we're paused as the Air Force goes through its acquisition down select, which is appropriate.
So, and I'll allow General Rand to answer the question as well, but so if I understand, we've decided that total commonality doesn't make sense for the reasons that you gave. There'll be some level of partial commonality.
Yes, sir.
And what I'd like to know from General Rand and from you, Admiral, is the year in which we can expect the answer to the question that you're trying to get to that's currently paused.
So if I may, I'll just finish and then turn it over to General Rand. In terms of dollar cost savings, sir, I'm going to contend that based on the Air Force decision of down select to 2 from the 3 potential bidders today to the final solution, I think we need to get to that final solution working through this down select before we'll be able to provide you a definitive dollar savings in the year. But
when can we expect to get there?
Well, yes, sir. We're right now hopefully going to have a down select of 2 competitors this summer. That will give us more fidelity. We'll run the TMRR, the Technology Maturation Risk Reduction process, for 3 years with those 2 competitors, and then we'll further down select to the source in 2021. So that it'll take a little while to get some of this fidelity. If I may, sir, first of all, I'm the requirements guy. I'm not the acquisition. I don't drive acquisition strategy. We've set the requirements, and we've delivered those requirements as we see for GBSD. However, I do think there's a misconception, as Terry was talking about, what commonality is. A D5 is not going to work in the land-based missile. It's not going to fit in our launch facilities. It would take a major overhaul to do that. So when you define commonality, the term that we've used is smart commonality. And where can we have synergy together? And we are looking at repair facilities, manufacturing processes, test capabilities. All those could significantly reduce redundant in multiple kind of platforms. And those where the savings will be. So we're very supportive of commonality. But we believe in open competition, and that's where the acquisition strategy is driving us right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, for 5 minutes.
We just passed in the House Foreign Affairs Committee a resolution dealing with Venezuela and the economic circumstances that they face, and quite frankly, what Venezuela is going through is devastating. 75% of their population has experienced a weight loss of at least 19 pounds over the past year because they cannot get enough calories in food to sustain their body weight. Medicines are now in short supply because the people can't afford them, the government can't afford them. You've got diseases that were once eradicated coming back. And the reason I bring up these topics is we've been warned by the Congressional Budget Office and by the Comptroller General of the United States of America and by the Government Accountability Office that America's current financial path is unsustainable, which means that in the future we're risking a similar collapse. And you can imagine the adverse effect that that would have on our military capabilities in particular if we go through the same thing that economic reality dictates is going to happen if we don't change our trajectory. That being the case, and I don't know if any of y'all are in a position to answer this question, but what can you do in the areas that you oversee to increase efficiency so that taxpayers can get more bang for the buck, or in the alternative, what can you eliminate if the need arises, thereby saving money that might reduce the dangers associated with our deficit? And if you can't do anything in the fields that you personally oversee, what do you think we should be doing on a larger scale to minimize our risk of a debilitating insolvency and bankruptcy that our financial gurus warn us is in our future?
Sir, thank you for the question, and I understand your point. Trident has been a program, strategic systems programs, has been in existence for 61 years, and as we build the new Columbia class, the Navy's #1 priority in shipbuilding, that boat will be in the water through 2084. As I've looked at my contribution to that program, the strategic weapons system, we recently, in discussions with Lockheed, endorsed their plan to move our workforce out of an extremely high-cost area to 2 other locations within the United States, which
I hope Alabama's on that list.
No, sir.
You might want to look at the cost of doing business in Alabama.
Granted.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, sir. But once we do this, and it's a very fast-paced move, we'll move to Colorado and to Florida. The return savings to the program is somewhere in excess of $55 million a year. So we understand our contribution to the strategic deterrent, to the triad, to the nation. We also understand our responsibility to do so in the most cost-effective manner possible. So that's, I would say, one of the solution spaces that we constantly review and invoke within the program, given the long-term future that we have in support of this mission.
Vice Admiral Benedict, that is wonderful news. Does anybody else have any suggestions on what we can do to try to protect America's financial status?
So in the area that I work, sir, in the CIO area, I'm specifically tasked to look at effectiveness and efficiency, and I work very closely with the DCMO for the Department of Defense. And we're looking at competition, more importantly in the IT space, if you will. Much of what we procure is commercial off-the-shelf technology. So increased use of commercial off-the-shelf technology where we don't engage in making changes to it. So imposing and using change management to constrain costs in the procurement of business systems is very important. I know not directly related to this, but the savings you generate from those systems can be used for other purposes. For example, we're looking at the defense travel system right now, and we're looking at moving to commercial applications. I'm currently assessing pilots to put in place about 15,000 to 30,000 users to see how it goes, and eventually to move to something that is commercial with very little change management.
Thank you, Dr. Zangardi. We're running out of time. I've got 10 seconds. I would strongly encourage each of you to do whatever you can to try to put more efficiency into the federal acquisition process, particularly the federal acquisition regulatory process. In my experience and observation over the decades, it seems that the procurement process has gotten drawn out more and more at higher and higher cost, and there has to be a way to fix that. Thank you for your time and insight.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Klotz, I want to follow up on your comments on MOX. I was down there last year, and some of the numbers that you were quoting are direct contradiction to what we saw and what we heard in terms of percentage finished of the plant. Literally a few weeks ago, we allocated $345 million, and you said in year 18 we have $279 million. What's that being used for if you're canceling the project? I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
My bad. The actual amount would be for 270 for the MOX fuel fabrication facility itself. There's another $9 million that's associated with other aspects of our plutonium disposition mission. In any large government contract, particularly a large construction effort that has been underway for some years in South Carolina, there are termination costs. There are a series of steps we have to take dictated by statute and dictated by our own regulations to wind down a contract. So if the Congress agrees with the administration's proposal to terminate MOX, then we will come back to you with a specific plan as to what we have to do to meet those regulatory requirements, and at the same time, how we will proceed with the facility that has been constructed thus far.
So $500 million for termination fees?
I'd be happy to come back to you and lay out what the costs are associated with termination.
So a year ago, they were almost 70% complete. I assume they got further along this year.
Well, we don't, quite frankly, and with respect to those who calculate a higher percentage, the standard practice for calculating percent complete, at least within the federal government, is cost already expensed and cost to go. So if you accept our estimates, or don't have to take my estimates, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the total project cost of $17 billion, we've already spent, as I indicated, $5 billion. That would leave $12 billion to go. So 5 divided by 12 is less than 50%. So our assumption of the way in which we calculate, percent complete is different than others have calculated it.
Well, certainly then we have to get to the bottom of that, because we're talking some considerable money as compared to what we just heard about in a few minutes. I'll yield back.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Chairman Wilson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Mike Rogers, for your leadership of the subcommittee with the bipartisan input of Ranking Member Jim Cooper. Again, thank each of you for your service. It's extraordinary on behalf of our nation. And of course, General Klotz, I am keenly interested in the mixed oxide fuel fabrication facility. Last year, Congress thoughtfully, in a bipartisan manner, rejected the prior administration's short-sighted proposal to terminate the mixed oxide fuel fabrication facility, the MOX program, which is 70% completed in the area of South Carolina and Georgia. The Congress had many concerns with the alternatives, including the legal, regulatory, and political issues with storing the entirety of 34 metric tons. The fact that it does not comply with the Plutonium Management Disposition Agreement, PMDA, with the Russian Federation, and the fact that Congress does still not have a complete valid cost estimate of the MOX program because the Department of Energy never completed a full rebaseline. Ultimately, the authorizers and appropriators both agreed to continue construction of MOX as the best path forward and included legislative text requiring it in the FY 15, 16, and 17. And the question, has an industrial-scale dilute and dispose method with weapons-grade plutonium ever been done before? If not, what is the, if not processed, what is the timeline for removal from South Carolina and Georgia?
Thank you very much, Congressman Wilson. In terms of what we know about dilute and dispose, we already have 5 metric tons of diluted plutonium, largely from the Rocky Flats facility that used to be in Colorado, in WIP as we speak. We have also diluted plutonium that existed at South Carolina, that was in South Carolina, and have shipped that to WIP. In fact, we've done 3 shipments already this year since, as was alluded to earlier, WIP has reopened for operations. I went down to WIP about a month or so ago and personally toured the site and was briefed on what they believe the capacity of WIP is to hold not only non-weapons-grade plutonium, but all 34 metric tons. And I came away from that quite convinced that 34 metric tons can fit within the WIP facility. The other, I think, very, very interesting point about this whole process is it allows us to get plutonium out of the state of South Carolina far sooner than would be the case.
And let's get to that now. Because WIP is not industrial grade now, but you're describing something industrial grade. And what is the timeline? And specifically, how many years are you talking about? Because my constituents are very concerned about being a dump and a disposal area, which puts our region at risk.
Well, I don't understand the term industrial facility.
It's the capability to truly process a large amount.
Yeah. Well, we have the ability to. What we would have to do is, like I said, we're already processing plutonium at Savannah River. And what it would require would be adding.
Okay, back again, because time's running out. What is the timeline? My constituents and the people of South Carolina and Georgia would like to know.
Let me give you this the specific timeline. It's not showing up on what I have right here sitting in front of me, but I will tell you it is far faster than anything can be done with MOX.
And that timeline would be, because the reprocessing is gone, okay. But what you're describing could take years.
Okay, here's our estimate. If we went down what we call the surplus plutonium disposition project, we expect that we would complete the work that we need to do that by 2027. And plutonium disposition would begin in 2028 and end in 2049. If we go down the MOX route, we would not complete the project to 2048. That is, my rough calculation, 20-some-odd years later. And we would not begin disposing of plutonium through a MOX facility until the year 2050 to 2051, assuming that we get all the NRC licensing completed. And plutonium disposition would not end until 2065, which is, again, 15, 20 years after what we would be able to do with the surplus, the approach we would like. The main difference, however, is the total project cost for MOX we estimate to be $17 billion. The total project cost for the surplus disposal that we have suggested, right now we have a range of $200 to $500 million to do that. And if the Congress gives us the authority.
My time is up, but indeed, please look at the, we want to remove by reprocessing the weapons-grade plutonium. What you're describing is, I consider long-term, but thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to direct this question to Dr. Soofer only because of the fact that your testimony referenced it. We are in the process of doing the nuclear posture review. You're in the process of doing that. I think it's a review that's usually done every 5 to 10 years. I think the last one was in 2010. My question is really one more practicality. We have heard people take positions on the triad and what we should be funding. I think even the Secretary of Defense at one time had taken a position questioning whether or not the triad is the way to go. We have someone who we have all listened to in terms of his review of the QDR, and that, of course, is former Secretary of Defense William Perry at Stanford, who has said basically he doesn't like the triad system and questions the whole use of long-range missiles, for example. And I think at one point he even questioned whether we should have the concentration of ICBMs as well. So given that, and given the fact that this review isn't going to be done till the end of the year, and I understand that we should continue along the way, decisions that we are to be made on major expenditures, such as the new bomber, B-21s, and all the different types of what is expected to do the nuclear defense posture for this country. How do you justify that at this particular point in time when we've got people whose opinions some of us value, I think most of us at least will pay attention to? How can you come before us and take a position when we know that there is at least enough of a concern that the posture has been required to be reviewed?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think there's a sense, we feel there's a sense of urgency to get on with the program of record because the current systems will age out within the next 10 to 15 years. And if we do not begin or continue the process of acquiring new systems, there will be a gap in deterrence capability. The previous administration has laid in a nuclear modernization program that, again, appears to be consistent with general principles of nuclear deterrence. We will examine these principles and determine, in light of the new strategic environment, whether they still obtain. But there are some basic fundamentals, such as maintaining a nuclear triad, that the Secretary of Defense has already endorsed. And so, quite frankly, it's just a sense of urgency that if we do not continue the programs this year, there may be a gap if it's ultimately determined that these systems are needed.
Well, I understand that the Secretary may have said he's endorsing it now, but there was a point in time, maybe it was before he became Defense Secretary, that he called into question the premise of the triad as well. And the fact that the NPR has basically now been mandated is problematic. I understand the urgency that we speak about here. Theoretically, I understand all of that. However, we've never had such an emphasis that I recall where most of the briefings that we've had in a very short period of time has concentrated on our nuclear position. And I understand that's probably triggered by Russia, China, and North Korea. However, the concept of developing a systematic posture and to review that posture seems to be one that we need to be very certain about that threat and how we best address that threat. And that is why for the expenditures that we are being asked to authorize, how do we know that this is the best way for us to proceed? And I'm out of time, so we may have to take it.
If I may, ma'am, I need to comment on one comment you made about the B-21. We can have the discussion about the nuclear posture and the triad, but the B-21 will be a dual-capable airplane. There's a requirement for long-range strike conventionally, and that will be obviously what that airplane would be doing. Any delay to that program would be devastating. Our newest bomber is 25 years old.
I understand that, General. The question more is a matter of number, whether it's 100 or 200. We've heard two numbers. That's a huge amount of numbers, but shouldn't we know whether
the requirement right now is for 100 B-21s.
Mr. Chair, I yield back. I think that votes were called.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Desjardins, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair. This will be a question for Mrs. Kange and General Klotz. During our Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee hearing in March on NNSA's deferred maintenance and infrastructure challenges, we briefly discussed how certain OMB directives have negatively impacted NNSA's ability to get after its decaying infrastructure. In particular, OMB Management Procedures Memorandum 2015-01 was identified as a huge problem because it perhaps unintentionally slows NNSA's ability to tear down old buildings and build new ones. General Klotz, can you give us your personal views on that OMB memorandum and whether it impedes NNSA from making smart decisions and moving efficiently to deal with infrastructure problems?
Thank you very much for that question. I think the intent behind the directive, which is as you build new buildings, you ought to dispose of excess facilities, is a good one. When I was in the Air Force, the rule used to be build a building, tear a building down. Otherwise, you see this behavior where people start to move into those buildings which you've moved out of, and you still have an infrastructure issue. However, I think the notion that you have to do this simultaneously is more constraining than it needs to be. I hear anecdotally, I haven't had a chance to get the empirical data on that maybe some site directors would choose to wait to build a new building until they knew they had enough money that they could dispose of an older building. So I would like to see, it's good intent, but I would like to see a little more flexibility in terms of how we actually balance new construction with demolition and disposition of old buildings.
Okay. In general, I understand your budget request will put an additional $195 million above the FY17 appropriated level toward deferred maintenance and repair needs at NNSA, and that you, Mrs. Kange, have a line in your budget for $225 million to deal with 4 excess facilities at Y12 and Lawrence Livermore. This is good news, but I need to ask you, General Klotz, could you execute additional money on deferred maintenance and repair needs if it was provided by Congress?
The backlog of deferred maintenance is so large that what we have asked is not going to buy all of it down. So it's a question of timing in terms of which the money comes. We do have there are some capacity limits in terms of local craft and companies to be able to do that. The other challenge we have in NNSA, and this is where Ms. Kange has to help us out, is many of the facilities we have, particularly facilities in Y12 and our other laboratories, are contaminated with either radioactive materials or other contaminants, and we have to go through the process of decontaminating those facilities first before we can do the standard demolition of that. So there are some significant costs associated with some of our facilities.
So the $3.7 billion backlog isn't going to get fixed without additional funding in all likelihood?
Well, look, thanks to this committee's strong support, we stabilized the level of deferred maintenance we had in fiscal year 16. With 17, we'll see it decrease slightly, modestly, and if the Congress supports the FY18 budget, we'll continue that downward slope. Okay. I might add that again, through the support of Congress, one of the good news things that came out of the passage of the omnibus FY17 omnibus bill is we'll be able to proceed with the demolition of the Bannister Federal Complex in Kansas City, which is a 5 million square foot facility, World War II facility, of which we used about 3 million. That is now, with the funding provided by the Congress, we will now be able to go ahead and do that and also save the federal government a considerable amount of money in how we do that by allowing a private developer to do the demolition and the remediation of the property.
Okay, Ms. Kange, do you expect to continue into FY19 and beyond the excess facilities line with environmental management program? I think it's a great idea and would encourage you to continue it, but is that your intent?
Yes, we certainly hope to be able to continue to address excess contaminated facilities across the DOE complex. I will mention that the 2016 report to Congress that the department submitted on excess contaminated facilities estimates approximately $32 billion to address all of the excess facilities across the department's entire complex.
All right, thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, we have about 9 minutes left to vote, so I want to go ahead and try to get Mr. Garamendi in before we head over to the chamber, and then we'll come back after votes for the closed session. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, all of this is extremely important. I want to go to follow up on Mr. O'Rourke's questions about commonality, and specifically, Admiral Benedict, you have a couple of new bombs that are being reworked, the W-88 and the W-76. Are those, my understanding is they're supposed to last some 20 years or more into the future. Is that correct?
Sir, our planning factors are the life extension programs are a 30-year extension to the existing life of the weapon itself.
Okay, so some 30 years. Do you need the interoperable weapon?
Sir, at the direction of the Nuclear Weapons Council, the Navy, the Air Force, and NNSA were directed to conduct a study. That study was scheduled to commence in 2020, and we will do both the technical analysis of the IW as well as the cost analysis. That information will be presented approximately late 21, 22 to the Nuclear Weapons Council for review, concurrence, and approval if they so deem so.
I'm sorry, 8/21/22, what is that?
I'm 2021, 2020, 2021,
So for the
2022.
next 3 years, we'll continue to spend money on the interoperable
We will spend money to do the technical analysis between the services and NNSA.
Excuse me, I
Yes, sir.
back and forth here, and I hope in a way that is not. So if you have two weapons
Yes, sir.
that currently work on the missiles, and your missiles are good for 30 years, and your weapons are good for 30 years, do you ever need an interoperable for at least 30 years?
Sir, I would say, and then I'll defer to General Klotz here for 1 second. The Navy does not have a requirement for a third reentry body. However, as we look at the complex in total, this issue of IW is larger than just a single Navy issue. It involves Navy, Air Force, and the NNSA.
So where would the Air Force use this new interoperable?
If I could, Congressman Garamendi, first of all, there is no money in the NNSA account for working on the interoperable.
I heard there's some money somewhere.
Well, there's not explicitly for interoperable on ours. We recall a few years ago we deferred the need date for that till 2030. So our expectation, as we've laid it out, is we'll begin the very serious work on that in 2020 because it's about a 10-year process. And the reason why we have been proceeding down the path of having an interoperable is there is an Air Force system that will require a life extension program in about the 2030 timeframe. That's the W-78 warhead. So there was the thinking when this strategy was developed was, well, if we're going to do a life extension program to an Air Force system, wouldn't it make sense in terms of long-term cost and efficiency if, as you did that particular warhead, you designed it in such a way that it could be used by both the Air Force and the Navy and subsequent interoperable warheads, so that you had some commonality beyond back and forth between the two services as you got in the 2030, 2040, 2050 timeframe.
And your 50 to 80 new pits, your requirement for 50 to 80 new pits, plutonium pits, is it based on this interoperable scheme that is somewhere off there in the future?
It's based on a number of factors. One of the factors is requirements for the next series of life extension programs, which would include the interoperable warhead.
We don't have too much time to get into this, but I really want to get into this in great detail because it seems to me that we're about to spend billions of dollars to do something that ultimately isn't going to happen. This interoperable warhead, I was looking over here at the Navy, and they're saying not for 30 years. And I haven't had a chance to get to General Rand about this, but I'd like to know exactly when his 30-year period is going to begin. And I'm out of time, and we've got votes, and thank you so very, very much.
I thank the gentleman. Just in closing, before we recess to meet after votes in the SCIF for the closed session, I want to put on the record, General Rand, in 2006, the Air Force identified the UH-1N helicopter as not effective for the IBM security mission. Last year, Secretary James recommended an acquisition strategy that would have sole sourced these helicopters. Secretary Carter then shelved that strategy and directed full and open competition. General Rand, can you commit that you will make it clear to the entire Air Force that anyone who attempts to interfere with the acquisition of this capability will have absolute hell to pay?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. We're in recess.